What's up, DE students? Mr. Martinez here to give you your first episode of something called the History Talks. If you don't know what History Talks is, this is a pre-recorded lesson, a lecture that goes along with your History 12 class, with the history we've been learning and what we're going to continue to learn even with Mr. Martinez's leave. Now, these history talks are a ed puzzle that's been embedded with some checkpoints so that we can check for understanding as we go through the history that we're learning. And also because it's an ed puzzle, it allows you to go at your own leisure, having you being able to pause and rewatch as many times as you want. And this is going to be a new format we're going to use for the first part of our school semester. And we're going to use it to continue that learning. Now, let's talk about what we last learned in this class. Last time that we talked, we finished around the era of Andrew Jackson. We were talking around that mid-19th century American history. This, of course, is right where we start to have a new democracy with Andrew Jackson and his administration. We're also seeing the large expansion being further pushed from east to west of this continent. And we're also seeing constant tension brewing between the two groups that are created in our country, which we'll call North and South, as there's this battle of local debates on where does this new government lie on states' rights and how one wishes to operate in society. This is where we're going to be starting with our new unit, our new segment called Divisive Expansion. And today is our first episode into it. Now, all of the episodes you're about to learn when it comes to Divisive Expansion Unit are all the prerequisites, the stage that is created for the biggest, most bloodiest battles that have ever happened on our continent, which is the Civil War. We're talking about what's leading us up to that cause. So as you're learning these lessons, keep those things in mind as we continue and keeping an idea that these are all the causes that are leading up to the final trigger being pulled with the Civil War. Now, for today, we are looking at 1800 to 1864, and we're going to talk about antebellum slavery. That's what my background's all about. It's the theme, of course, of antebellum slavery, which is talking about Southern slave culture. Let's go ahead and take a look at what our standards are or our objectives. Like I said, our objective today is all about antebellum the South and slavery. We're going to talk a little bit more about the development of slavery under the American system and the economics behind it. We're also going to highlight some of the conditions of slavery, as far as like life expectancy, diet, etc., that helps us see and capture what this system and life was like for those who were subscribed to it by force. And we're also going to talk about the development of African-American society, even within chains, as they create their own communities within the circumstances that have been given to them. And of course, how this conversation of slavery is still a hot topic between the North and South, as everyone is afraid of what would truly happen if we released it, as far as the policies and stuff like that. Our essential question: how do you maintain a vision to which others may not understand? This is a huge theme, as you're seeing that such a huge push with both North and South of what ought to be American society and what should be allowed. So let's have a conversation about the South. The last time we talked about it, it was British American society. Well, we're speeding past that, and now we're in the times of that antebellum slavery with American society. And what's changed since the last time we've looked at it? Well, we understand in the 1800s, the South is growing. Now, its growth is different than the North, and this is a very big deal later on. We've talked about this idea of something called industrialization, which is manufacturing changing towards new technology that's being utilized in society, either that being trains being used to transport goods or people, or talking about factories that are able to produce more goods for a cheaper price. Manufacturing is big. It is huge. Industrialization, especially. The North is doing really good at this. The North has developed far more when it comes to industrialization than the South. Though, even though that's true, the South is not growing. It is still growing, but in a different way. It's not developing, but its expansion is still continuing. So how do they do that? Well, it's them not doubling down on industrialization. It's them doubling down on what they know, which is agriculture. The South is known for their agriculture. They are the economic powerhouse when it comes to agriculture and the export goods that America is producing for the world. We've mentioned a couple of these agriculture goods in the past. It's still the same things that we've mentioned. So tobacco, rice, sugar, especially cotton. These are the big things. Cotton, especially why this place, this antebellum South, is known as being called King Cotton, as the most cotton is being produced here out of anywhere else in the world. How much money are they making? Well, we're talking lots of money. If you're looking at my notes right here, we're talking about roughly $200 million within that cotton industry, and comparable to the other agricultural goods like rice being 2 million. This is significant for the time. And this is why you're starting to see a double down on agriculture expansion. This is the catch though. For the South to have agriculture expansion, it has to have a labor that matches it. And we know who's in the fields actually picking these cotton. It is not the actual plantation owners themselves or even white American society, but rather the enslaved African Americans who have been on this continent ever since 1619. These are the ones, and their families, of course, who are the ones who represent this economic boom. Of course, cotton becomes shirts and materials. Textile manufacturing is a huge segment, which is a spot that is also growing in the American South. But they're not manufacturing the goods at the end. They're still focusing on just the raw material extracting and then sending out. It's an interesting move. Talking about the South, there's some things that we need to talk about and the dynamics that come with the South, okay? In no means is the South unified. The South is very regional, meaning each region is extremely different and has its different aspects to it. Now, the only thing that they're all unified on is hating federal government. Any federal government policy, any federal government overhang is considered an outright disrespect to Southerners, regardless if they're the border South, middle South, or lower South. This is where they're unified, I guess. And you have to remember federal government in this time of a Southerner shows both authority and it shows centralized government from people who are Northerners, typically in their eyes, who they feel have no business telling them what they should do in the liberty of their land. So you can see why they have a disagreement with federal government, especially with their opinion on slavery. The North is majority against slavery, and they've grown into that more so. Now let's talk about those different regions of the South real quick. Here's something that we need to understand. Border South. This is where we're talking about Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. These are places where cotton was non-existent. Tobacco was the main slave crop, simply just because of climate reasons. Another interesting thing that we should acknowledge is that not all white families in the South have slaves. That's not to say that they don't tolerate or accept it, but it's rather that not everyone truly has a slave because it is considered in the eyes of these people, a property asset. It is expensive to have such indentured servants. And when we talk about the border South, only 22% of white families actually own slaves. They produce over 50% of the South's industrial products. So if there is any industrial aspects, it would be on the border, the cusp between South and North. Now, in the middle South, which is like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, this place you're starting to see a little bit more industry, but also that growing population of slavery. They're both there, with 36% of white families owning slaves. And then, of course, you got the lower South. And this is how I think many people see the South culture overall, which is what is known as the Black Belt. This is where you see almost a large majority of white families own slaves. Actually about 43%, so almost majority or almost half, frankly. Less than 2% of the population within these places of the South are free. There are these circumstances that are starting to grow, and we've talked about them a little bit, where some African-American slaves find a way to break the chains, either by paying off their owner or having some kind of deal. They are very rare, as only 2% of African Americans find a way to be free before Emancipation Proclamation. But that does not to say that things were fully accessible to them with rights and everything. In the South, though, this is the powerhouse of cotton. This is where 95% of the cotton is being produced. This is where a lot of sugar, indigo, and rice. This is the major economic powerhouse when it comes to the South. With all this, failed to still develop that large industrial economy. Once again, that humid climate was an issue. Also, the accessibility and also the financing, too, was an issue for the South to truly grow. But regardless of them to not grow industrially, they did grow agriculturally. And with that divisive expansion comes with the further expansion of slavery, which becomes an issue. Before we get to that issue, let's have a quick conversation. Checkpoint. How does the South grow but not develop in industrialization? Explain this part based on what you just learned before we continue. Perfect. Thank you for responding to that. And thank you for giving a good answer to that. Let's go ahead and carry on. So, talking about tensions of slavery. When is the moment the South knew they were going to secede? Well, we're not just there yet, but we are hearing mere rumors or people hinting towards an idea that the South should be far more independent without having to look at the North for permission for certain things. So here's an example of that growing tension. You have the famous DeBow's review. This is from James DeBow, a Southerner who was calling out the dangers of colonial relationship building between the North and South. He was calling out the toxic relationship between the two, just merely acknowledging the fact that there is a very big difference in the direction the North and the South want to go when it comes to American society. Why I think this is humorous is there's a level of irony. He talks about how he hates this idea of the North and the South's toxic relationship. He advocates for South independence, to be more reliant. He does this, of course, by publishing a book that outlines this, but it's printed in New York City, which is in the North because they don't have the manufacturing to be able to produce those books. And of course, it is circulated and moved within the advertisements of the North. So someone who's advocating for Southern freedom using Northerners manufacturing to be able to have such a conversation. It's just kind of interesting, but it's just worthy to acknowledge that this is something that's growing. Another thing that we should talk about, of course, is that Southerner culture. So if we're talking about that lower South, there is this new planter aristocratic system. Perhaps not new, it's been there since the beginning of the Southern culture being created after the American Revolution, but it's grown to its highest point where you have this elitist group of families who have a lot of power, and they start to create an oligarchy. An oligarchy means when a few have power. So what do I mean by this? Well, there was about 1,733 families who owned over 100 slaves, over 100 people, and they really dominated the platform and the Southern politics. So these wealthy white Southerners really prided themselves in the society that they were creating, and it was really looking and shadowing a lot of what English upper class society was like. And within this new dynamic, you start to see a lot of those traditional systems being created. For example, the treatment of women. Women were still centered their lives around the home at this time, but they're treated as more like children. For example, from George Fitzhugh, you start to hear this idea that women are fragile, in the need of protection, and can be easily corrupted. And that's why they must be contained or really kept safe to not be exposed to a society. So to really be a homebody. You start to also see the dynamics between the slaves and the owners also being a really interesting at the same time too. You start to see that there are certain things owners of these African-American slaves are able to get away with and even accepted and tolerated within this white upper class elitist society. For example, sex between slave owners and slaves were a common practice. We kind of mentioned that in class, especially in History 11, this idea of home growing your own slave population by the owners raping and forcing sex onto their slaves to produce children that they can then enslave later. Very interesting how white society at this time tolerates this. At the same point, it's also the sheltering and the keeping away of women, even white, from being a part of a lot of these things. For those who weren't a part of this white wealthy society, they're considered what we'll call plain folk. And these are about 75% of Southerners who are those who move up the social ladders within this aristocratic system. And the way they move up is by being a manager to the plantation and to the plantation owners. And they take on this overseer kind of position. Now, how these two were able to unify, meaning the white elitist and the plain folks, into creating this system that really, frankly, benefited the elitist, was, of course, by unifying under the factor, the idea of this racial superiority over people of color. And with that being the unifying front, you start to see that there is this alliance between the white elitist and the poor whites in continuing this Southern culture. So, real quick as a checkpoint, how would you describe planter aristocratic society? Based on what you've heard and what you've seen, what is a way you would describe this peculiar society? Perfect, good job. Let's go ahead and carry on. So let's talk about how that Southern culture validated themselves or justified their ownership of slaves. Well, they had a saying for this, and that's where the title of this slide comes from, the peculiar institution. The peculiar institution, according to the Southerners, was simply this special but not odd relationship between the two. Within American South, slavery created a unique bond between masters and slaves, left Blacks to create a culture. So let's talk about this next part, which is called the peculiar institution. And this is how the Southerners validate and justify why they have such claim over people of color into enslavement. And they call this a peculiar situation, this idea that it is a special relationship, but not necessarily odd. What happens in American South society is African Americans are forced to subscribe to the common language of the society at this time, which is English, and of course, also subscribing to the master's religion, which was most likely Christianity. Now, these were the two biggest pushes, but that was pretty much it. The rest of it, the African Americans were able to create roughly this own society within the bounds of what they have been told they could do. Now, how do they run these actual plantations is something that I would like to acknowledge next, which is the difference between task and gang system. These were normally used in large plantations. Task, which was normally used for like rice fields, were when a master gave a particular task to the slaves, and once the slaves were done with the task of the day, then they were free to be on the property, off of work, off duty for the remainder of the day. Now, of course, how plantation owners make sure that they get the most out of these days is by creating a task that is going to be taking from the beginning of the day until the very end. So it is still a long workload. The other system is gang system, which is used a lot for those cotton, sugar, and tobacco fields. And this is where the African-American slaves are divided into these groups with one driver or overseer, one person who's in charge. Particularly, it would be those plain folks that we mentioned in the past, where they were expected to finish that job until the overseer deemed that it was done correctly. And this is a dynamic that we see a lot within popular movie culture, which shows a lot of plantation work. Now, this dynamic that we're talking about does not change for a very long time. This is going to be around until the moment the Civil War ends, where you start to see a change into this dynamic. When the emancipation came during the Civil War, you'll start to see house servants be the first people to leave the plantations. And house servants were those indentured servants who worked in the household, not so much in the fields. And especially because of sexual abuse, lack of privacy, these are going to be the first African-American slaves to leave the plantations, while the laborer slaves are going to be held onto for just a little bit longer. Now, while this peculiar institution was happening, there wasn't to say that there wasn't resistance. There wasn't just merely the African-American slaves continuing with this. There was forms of resistance in both a small form and a large form. The most common form of resistance by slaves was subtle defiance, meaning not working efficiently, not working to their full potential. Either sabotaging was another form, but there was ways that they would silently resist. But there was, of course, bigger resistance that also led to violence. There was numerous revolts that we can talk about, like the Santo Rebellion, the Vesey Rebellion, but one that I would like to focus on more so is the Nat Turner Rebellion in the 1830s. These rebellions were very intense. This is where you found African-American slaves or even some abolitionist allies who violently attack white plantation owners and plantation societies. And when you start to see this happen, it creates a huge paranoia among the South, because you have a lot of these white Southerners who start to look at African Americans as a danger, at one day that they will strike and attack. And this stays really fixated within Southern culture as they start to see such a large population of African Americans being among their society. And just to know that there would be any moment that they would be overturned if these people decided to collectively unite in a revolution or into a rebellion. This paranoia starts to lead to far harsher laws and treatment of African Americans, where you're going to start to see Blacks and slaves being pushed further into this abusive, preemptive attacks by Southern society to try to make sure that African Americans would not have an idea to rebel. Before we continue further on this lesson, I would really like us to take a moment to see how dramatic are these rebellions and how violent they can be, and how the paranoia between the two, especially within white society, could be increased after each of these rebellions. Go ahead and watch this video that's about to start for you, and come back to the video once you're done. Perfect. Thank you for taking a look at that legacy of Nat Turner. Now, something that we should also mention as another form of resistance, of course, is also runaway slaves. This is when you have African-American slaves who decide to leave the plantations and to make it somewhere where more north, where they would feel to be more free. Now, the thing that makes this more difficult is, one, of course, is the geographic distance it would take for a Southerner slave to make it to a safe haven up north, especially trying to get past the slave patrols that have been created, the paddy wagons, where there are those who are looking for intentionally any runaway slaves. This was another form of resistance. But talking about that a little bit more within this peculiar institution, you start to see a way for African Americans to still create some form of identity. There is countless songs and music that is created in this antebellum slave society culture. And a lot of it was created as a form of expressing emotions and also as another way of passing time during the work times. Another interesting thing, of course, is the slave family dynamic and laws that are created, as they were very intentionally designed to keep the families of these African-American families broken. For example, a child of a slave could be sold after reaching 3 years old. The reason for this is to create a dysfunctional family tie system where African Americans have less that they're willing to fight for. So many African American families are going to be forced to be divided and to be traded off with places where the families may never reunite. And this was a common practice as a form of punishment if a slave was not cooperating, or as a way to make sure that there was no unified front among African Americans. And you would see 1/3 of families be broken this way, as many would not see their loved ones once at a certain age within this plantation society. And it was all as a way to keep control, as a lot of these plantation owners saw these people clearly as not people, but rather as mere property, and in any sense, a paternal kind of approach to it, where they saw themselves as like a parent, as someone above them, as authority, and knew what was best for these people. Just do a quick checkpoint on this one. Describe how slaves resisted, like Nat Turner, and the counter reaction from white society. Answer that real quick based on what you just learned from these slides. Good job. And congratulations. You just finished your first history talk. Hopefully it wasn't that too bad for you. But in this lesson, just as an overview, we have highlighted and examined a little bit of that antebellum slave society. And we've talked a little bit about the growing tensions along that conversation, both in slave rebellions and politics on the conversation of slavery. We're going to continue this conversation in our next episode. But until then, we're going to stop right there. Go ahead and finish this video, fill out the last few questions, and carry on with the next few segments with this week on antebellum slavery. That, of course, being an assignment and a discussion board later on this week. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to teaching you more.